Good afternoon, everybody, and you're very welcome to the fifth session of Public Service Innovation Week. My name is Grace O'Regan. I work in the Reform Delivery Office at the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. Today's session is how strategic foresight can help public servants anticipate and better prepare for the future. And before I introduce our three panel speakers, I'd just like to talk to you a bit about the context of our panel discussion today and what we're hoping to achieve over the 90 minutes. As we all know, the COVID crisis has highlighted the role of the public service in the last number of months, particularly the health sector in terms of dealing with the immediate health impact of the crisis, and then the wider public service in terms of the local authorities' roles in the community, central government's role in giving people the support that they require, the education sector. It's been a whole of public governance response, and it very much underlines the significance for public institutions in maintaining economic and social well-being. While it might be too soon to determine what the exact roadmap to recovery is going to be, it is clear that the public service will be a key driving force in Ireland's recovery from the pandemic, both in social and economic terms. Now, in the Reform Delivery Office, we look after our Public Service 2020, which is the development and innovation framework for our public service. We will be starting to develop the new framework, the successor framework, OPS 2030, which is the innovation development framework that will see us out to 2030. Within this, we are conscious of the need to put measures in place today that will ensure that our public service across all the sectors is fit for purpose for the challenges that will be facing Ireland out to 2030 and beyond. One of the measures that we're looking at to ensure that we're fit for purpose is strategic foresight, the topic that we're looking to explore today. Now, our experience with COVID-19 really underlines that we're living in a fast-changing world. There's many more complexities to consider. There's greater uncertainties. As we're working through all of this, and we've also come out of the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and we're looking to climate crisis. We understand, and others, OECD and others, are saying that each of these crises now cannot be seen as individual events any longer. There will be cascading effects from one crisis into another. And the public service, in order to deal with this new environment, needs to be resilient and needs to be agile. And part of what we will be trying to do and to develop the next public service reform plan, our Public Service 2030, will be to consider all these factors and to try and work out what the public service needs to be doing today in order to be fit for purpose into the future. So, as well as these crises and the cascading effects of these crises, which we will have to understand and consider and work out how to deal with, we also need to be aware of fundamental transformations that are underway. Emerging technology, aging populations, climate change is happening very fast. Ultimately, we need to ensure that our public service is resilient and is able to address the needs of our citizens as we work out how to deal with these crises, the long-term implications and possible mitigation measures. Development of OPS 2030 should be seen as a potential driver and enabler of the significant change now required in the stewardship of our economy and society. The challenges of climate change and other megatrends need to be fully understood in order that we can avail of the opportunities of digitalisation, for example, and to navigate future crises while continuing to deliver people-centred public services. So I'm now going to introduce you to our three panellists, and we're very fortunate here today. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Piret, Tõnurist. Piret is Senior Project Manager at the OECD. Piret leads 3 programmes in the Observatory of Public Service Innovation. She's an expert on systems thinking, measurement and anticipatory innovation governance. Piret works towards aligning foresight and futures work with the everyday innovation practice in the public sector. Piret holds a research fellowship at Caltech and does research in organisational studies, public sector innovation, technology governance, digitalisation and decision-making under uncertainty. She's worked together with innovation teams and labs from all around the world. She's previously advised the Parliament of Estonia and helped build up the innovation team for the State Audit Office there. She holds a PhD and an MA from Taltech in technology governance and an MSc from Leuven in policy evaluation. Our second speaker, who we're also delighted to welcome, is joining us from Singapore. Aaron Marniam is a Singaporean civil servant, having served the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the Centre for Strategic Futures, the Civil Service College and the Ministry of Trade and Industry. Aaron is currently Deputy Secretary at the Ministry of Communications and Information, where he oversees digital economics, digital regulation, digital literacy and access, and public sector broadcasting. In his free time, Aaron is a published and award-winning poet. He facilitates interreligious dialogues, teaches at the National University of Singapore Scholars Programme. Aaron is a young global leader in the World Economic Forum, an Asia 21 young leader of the Asia Society, and a fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. Our third speaker, who we're also delighted to welcome from closer to home, is Barry Lowry, our Chief Government Information Officer for the Irish Government. Barry has held this role since April 2016. Barry's primary focus is taking forward the public service, ICT and e-government strategies. These set out the ambitions for developing the use of shared services, digital services and data to better serve the people of Ireland and ensure that Ireland is well placed to benefit from European initiatives such as the Digital Single Market. Barry was previously the Director for IT Shared Services and Strategy and head of the IT profession within the Northern Ireland Civil Service. Barry is a Fellow of the Irish and British Computer Societies and is a former winner of the BCS Northern Ireland IT Profession of the Year. So we're delighted to have such experts joining us today. And I'd like to start by posing a challenge to our panelists. In looking to develop our public service 2030, out to 2030, how can we draw on strategic foresight to help public servants anticipate and better prepare for the future? Given that OPS 2030 should reflect what the world will look like in 2030, the challenges and the opportunities we may face, and the capabilities we will need as a public service to efficiently navigate the new world, where we will need to anticipate changes that will emerge in the future. We will need to future-proof our policies, and we must embrace innovation as the expectation rather than the exception. How can we do this? We want to design a public service that is strategically agile, that is resilient, that can manage a complex and fast-changing environment. So, looking to you for your advice and your insights, I'd like to first invite Piret. And conscious to mention our audience, we have over 250 public servants and academics joining us today. I'd like to welcome everyone, and we're delighted so many people have joined us. We're inviting our audience to address questions to the panelists over the course of the session, and we'll come to those at the end of the meeting. But firstly, Piret, thank you so much for joining us, and we'd like to invite you to make your presentation to the audience, please.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you for having me. So hello, everybody. Hello, everybody who's listening. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction into what strategic foresight is and how it can actually be used for the benefit of thinking about the future, or even thinking about what Ireland and the public sector of Ireland might look like in the 2030 as well. So going to the next slide with the definition of strategic foresight, it really is a collective intelligence exercise about what the type of future that we want to see happening, what are plausible futures, but also preferable futures, not only about the scary future that we want to not happen, but also the kind of the systemic participatory, inclusive practice of creating a preferable future that we want to see happening in its entirety. Strategic foresight is also something that deals with the medium or long-term aspects of the future itself. So this is not only about what is going to happen tomorrow. So if we're talking about crisis response, then you have to have tactical responses. So if you have a foreseen or unforeseen crisis happening, there are going to be things that are going to be unpredictable. like with the COVID case as well. So you have to do a lot of tactical adaptation on the ground. So when you're building up your public service, you also have to have this kind of flexibility to be agile and respond to these upcoming challenges basically on the go. So that is the kind of the technical side of crisis response. But when we're talking about strategic foresight as well, then there's a kind of two-speed activity that has to happen in the public sector. When you're doing the kind of tactical response, you also want to be thinking about the systemic and cascading effects of different things that are upcoming, even in a crisis situation. And more importantly, you also want to be ahead of the game in many ways. So you want to also not only think about the future, but frame it. So based on your action today, because we only have today, you also want to steer policies towards the common objective that you want to see happening. And that is really the kind of the strategic part of the foresight activities that we are talking about. And going on to the next slide, there is a very big difference, and something worth also mentioning is that strategic foresight doesn't equate risk management. So strategic foresight processes and collectively making assumptions about future threats or hazards known doesn't mean that it's exactly the same as risk management. So strategic foresight gives information to risk management programs. So it gives to kind of these risks of how likely a risk is basically to happen, or how big potentially its impact is. So we're dealing with kind of the lists of hazards and risks and trying to keep our system stable. So strategic foresight gives information for that, but it's not the only thing it does. So strategic foresight only doesn't say that the public sector has to be resilient to those risks, but it also has to outline the opportunities and potential kind of future pathroads to new type of society or new type of public sector that we want to see happen. And what is very important here is that it actually leads to action. So it leads to decision making on the ground. So it doesn't only kind of inform or become a tick in the box exercise, that it actually becomes something that we use to change our policy aims or challenges or operating systems. Because what we saw happening on the ground in the recent years was that the kind of the foresight systems were really good at actually predicting the importance of pandemics. They were very good also translating that kind of hazard or risk into risk management systems. So most countries, also including Ireland, had pandemics as major risks within their risk management systems. And there were also very large scenarios of concrete kind of operational responses to pandemics in different countries. But it doesn't mean that it actually translated in most countries into concrete actions or operational changes within the government structures. So we didn't actually innovate based on that approach. So we did foresight, but there was nothing strategic about that. So when we go on towards the kind of how to make strategic foresight actually inform decisions on the ground and inform innovations, then we go into the next slide that we see that there are different methods to strategic foresight that help us unearth our assumptions, help us scan for weak signals or early signals about upcoming changes, be it risky changes or be it also positive changes that we want to take advantage of. And it also helps us to identify change drivers and our key uncertainties connected to that. So strategic foresight can be also done badly when you have these Cassandra effects where you involve many different people and experts and you were able to scan for different signals, but those people telling you the information that you don't want to hear do not actually get heard. So, I mean, if somebody said a couple of years ago that 25% of Australia would be burning in a bushfire, then the likelihood of decision makers actually making decisions based on that assumption or a scenario or a simulation would have been highly unlikely. And yet, once gone through it, it doesn't seem that way anymore. So there are different biases and issues that also strategic foresight exercises need to take into account. And also to make this knowledge legitimate for decision makers to actually make decisions on. So if we go forward with the slides, we will also see that there are different kind of standard tools that governments use, from horizon planning, which is pretty much to detect early signals about the change that is upcoming. So we also say that these changes can be extremely fast. So one of the examples of this is, of course, the rise of Uber, and Airbnb, and platform economies, which is actually not something that has happened over the last decade. So even kind of from the first early signals, it hasn't been 10 years when we've seen the birth of platform economies. If we go onward to the slides, then there are also other methods connected to how strategic foresight can inform decision makings. So on this next slide, you will see the aspect of megatrends, so something that the European Commission is also talking about. So there are some things that we can foresee and some things that we cannot. So megatrends are kind of long-term predictions, long-term trends that are, we can see it from the data, that are that global driving forces behind some of these changes that are upcoming. We see changes in population and where they are living. For example, that we will have a huge increase in population in the African continent, that will have massive impact in terms of migration, that will have massive income in terms of economic effects. But this is also connected to climate change, aging, automatization, these big trends that we need to take into account and stress test our current policies, because if we want it or not, these trends will influence the policies that we're working on. Going on with the slides, on the next slide, we will also see visioning and backcasting. And this is something that is, in terms of strategic foresight, is very different from kind of traditional resilience. So resilience wants you to make your public sector as stable as possible. So any risks that happen, that your public sector is able to bounce back. But also the other side of strategic foresight is to say, we want Ireland or the Irish public sector to be best at something. We want to be ambitious in terms of the pictures connected to that, the Haussmann, and how the city of Paris was actually designed and why it looks the way it does. Because it was a vision of a few kind of leadership people, and how, redesign entirely the city. So starting from the visioning and then road mapping back, or backcasting, as we say, to say, if we want that vision to happen, what do we have to do today to make that happen in practice? So not only a negative agenda of being resilient to risks, but actually being robust enough to take advantage of the type of changes what we want to see happening. If we go on with the slides, we will also see one of the most used tools in the public sector for strategic foresight is scenario planning. And one of the kind of the leading questions is, which scenario should we believe or actually use? But scenarios are actually there to guide us to make different choices in policy. They're not there to map up the reality in its entirety. So you actually are supposed to stress test and think about, during the process of scenario planning, about what type of megatrends might be challenging, or what kind of wildcard events are challenging your policy field. So which type of ambition vision to follow or not follow. So the process is actually something that is informative to the policy that you design. And if you go on to the next slide, then the most important thing is to do something about it. So not only do strategic foresight or futures thinking for foresight's sake, but actually take that into practice. We tend to talk about different narratives and different metaphors of uncertainty and complexity and the black swans of events. But if we really want to deal with them, we have to actually take it into practice. And if we go into this next slide, then we will also see that what we're talking about here is being more proactive, as a government. So it's not only the question of waiting and seeing until platform economies or Uber comes to market. When we once actually read that early signal, then we actually start thinking about what, in 2011, what those platform economies actually would mean to the public sector, or the cascading effects to the climate change or availability of cars or traffic in the streets, for example. So if we go onward in the slides, we also see that at the OECD, we definitely work on this kind of value chain, the value chain of taking from the aspect of anticipation or using futures and foresight technologies and taking that to innovation. So innovating today based on that knowledge. So what in our operations or experiments or trials or pilots we should be doing now to actually get to that future vision, where we avoid risks or hazards that we don't want to see happen today already. And for that, we need actually a system that helps us to do that. So we need an anticipatory innovation governance system to do that. So the final slide, if we go onward, will show us also the mechanisms that we work on. So you actually need something to tell that you need to have an agency within your public sector that says that you have the tools and methods to both anticipate or use strategic foresight, but also innovate, explore and prepare experiments based on that information. And then you need also an authorizing environment, the leadership, your evaluation, your audit offices, your communication systems and public interest to also tell you in a way that is constructive that what you're doing is good, or what type of ideas should we follow. So something that allows this to practice to happen as well. So hopefully OPS 2030 will build up a kind of systemic approach of strategic foresight that helps to actually use that knowledge in practice. So we don't only talk about put the next pandemic into the risk registry and not do anything about it, that we actually get dynamic solutions and options on the ground to use in innovative terms to prepare for the next shock, or actually the next vision, what the public service of Ireland wants to achieve. Thank you very much.
Piret, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. What really strikes me from what you're saying is it's not just a matter of developing the future thinking. While it's critical to have the skills and to understand the methodologies and to develop the scenarios or the insights, if those insights aren't being plugged in to a system that is capable of interpreting them and responding to them, it's worthless. So this is a whole of government exercise really in order for strategic foresight to make a difference on the ground to citizens and society and the economy. And then the leadership piece as well, I was very struck by that having a vision. If we want to have, one of the best public services in the world, that's something we need to set out to achieve and work back to identify what it's going to take at this stage. What countries would you actually? I know Singapore is exceptional on strategic foresight, and we're delighted to be listening to Ara next. Apart from Singapore, what other countries globally within the European Union or elsewhere has devised a system that both addresses the governance piece? So it's not just that they've got excellent foresight, and as you're saying, many countries that identified a pandemic was something that would be on the horizon. What other countries are doing this in a way that is effective, and what is it about their approach that works?
I think that's kind of a key question as well, that there is no perfect system that I know of in terms of public sector and that has really cracked this, that is ahead of the game. In Finland, in Europe, we work together with Finland a lot because they have a long-term practice in futures and foresight thinking, but also the innovative practice in its context as well. So one thing to know about Finland is that it's a kind of a whole of government or centralized approach, because it's a very central national government in its entirety. So they have a competence center from the Prime Minister's office and the Ministry of Finance to actually put the community together and talk about these issues and raise kind of new goals to the community working on futures and foresight. But they have also recently tried, as is the case with Singapore, is to tie these expertise on the ground with the type of activities and policies that the ministries themselves are developing. So not only kind of parliamentarian futures committees and high-level kind of networks, but also people with this expertise working together on a ministerial level on different policies and programs. So actually creating the diversity of teams and methods on the ground where these policy changes are operationalized. So futures and foresight thinking is kind of tied in with the work on the ground. So you connect it to the theories of change that you want to see happening. So each ministry prepares also kind of its yearly foresight report or how they're using this information. So there are also incentives to force these things from happening. Okay. And in other countries around the world, we see also a very different approaches connected to that.
Okay, so key is actually having it built into the systems, the regular process and systems of governance, and presumably clear communications as well. You mentioned legitimacy earlier, that these insights are given weight and that they are understood by policy practitioners. You also mentioned that strategic foresight is systemic, but it's participatory. To what extent, for example, in Finland, is it the civil servants and experts that are involved in the developing of foresight? Does it include academics? Does it include decision makers and the government? Does it include citizens? How far can strategic foresight extend? Are there different ways of doing it?
Mm-hmm. So different ways of doing it. As I said to begin with as well, that it's a collaborative or collective intelligence exercise. And that is very important as well, because you never actually know where the next signal is coming from. So we can't assume that we have the best knowledge or our known partners have the best knowledge. So to connect us with a wide, diverse audience as possible, especially on the signal reading stage. And then there are also other aspects. So if you're dealing with kind of artificial intelligence for new upcoming things where you actually have to reach a social agreement to say, if we're visioning, then like what are the public values in which we want to play with artificial intelligence? What is acceptable for us? And this is something that the government alone cannot say. And this is also very difficult to do with others outside of the others aside, because we cannot say what future generations will find acceptable and won't find acceptable, because this is kind of up for debate and people change. I mean, our generation is very different from our parents' generation and before, because we live in a different time and context. So you have to facilitate and have those conversations very carefully. But I think that, broader discussions about future developments and values and how we want to actually see Ireland in different policy fields are something that should be done in a participatory way. Because it's not only for the civil service to say that this is the best way to imagine the future.
That's really interesting. So through discussing megatrends or engaging strategic foresight participatory discussions, you're basically creating a space for developing common understanding around values or what people want to see, or agreement around, what the shared future should look like and how to achieve it. That's really interesting.
But also I'm going to be slightly making it a little bit complicated as well. Is that in sometimes when there has to be room for the crazy experiments as well. So, the things that everybody in your community will say, well, this is not going to work or won't happen. Nobody will know what is upcoming. So there has to be room for that exploration as well, where you only talk to lead users. So those that can really think about these crazy examples that are not legitimate until they're seen and touchable. So it's very difficult for some of these crazy ideas to come forward. So you actually have to have, when you're thinking about inclusion and participation within strategic foresight and especially innovation activities, you really have to have different levels about if I'm aiming for that, exploration of, what might work, we don't actually know, but we'll build it and we'll find out, versus some of these things are going to happen, or mega trends or automatization are going to hit, or artificial intelligence is going to influence how our society functions, what is acceptable for us? What are the value boundaries for us? So the engagement on these different questions is going to be different.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So that's requiring a certain open mindset in approaching these issues and asking these questions. It maybe wouldn't have been typical of a civil service or public service traditionally. So it's developed an innovation mindset and a foresight mindset around unknown futures. And I think, like you were saying, who would have seen the platform economies, coming to the fore, or on the negative implications of climate crisis, the fires in Australia. So we need to be more open-minded about the future and more inclusive and have more diverse people involved in those conversations in order to try and anticipate the unforeseen as well as what we can currently see or think we can see. Piret, that's really interesting. Thank you so much. We touched on a lot of really interesting themes there that I know Aaron and Barry may also wish to discuss. So Aaron, I'd like to move to you now. And like that, there may be similar themes that we've discussed already with Piret that you'd like to draw on, but really looking forward to your presentation. Aaron, just in doing some reading around the topic in advance of this, I came across an academic article that described the system of strategic foresight in Singapore as being exemplary. So we're delighted that you were here to tell us about the experience in Singapore, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much for this very kind invitation. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be with all of you. And I hope everyone is staying safe in these slightly mad and manic times that the world has managed to find itself. I agree with you very much. There's a whole bunch of echoes and rhymes and resonances between what Piret said and what I'd like to share here. And I hope that we'll be able to flesh out some of these connections between the different presentations during the discussion and Q&A. But what I'd like to do is really talk about 5 things that Singapore has learned over time in our experience with strategic foresight. We've been doing scenario planning since the late 1980s. It began as an experiment in the Ministry of Defense, as many things do, because ministries of defense are often large enough ecosystems to stress test new methods like scenarios. We moved the function to the Prime Minister's office in the 1990s as a way of signifying the importance of capturing the whole of government nature of this work. And you used the phrase whole of government earlier, which I think is exactly the right way to phrase this. Any futures project, I always feel, might start with a specific topic, right? It might be the future of innovation, the future of agriculture, the future of healthcare, but it quite rapidly grows into the future of everything, because any analysis of the future invariably is an analysis of the whole system and how that might affect a particular subset of that system. So we found that move to the Prime Minister's office was very useful. And I was very lucky to be posted to the Prime Minister's office in the mid-2000s when we were thinking about how we wanted to diversify the toolkit that we use to do strategic foresight. Because we found that scenario planning, one of the methods that Piret talked about, was hugely useful, right? Wonderful in terms of establishing the role that driving forces had in determining the future. But these driving forces were there, they were kind of long trends of change. The scenarios alone, what we found, were not as useful in identifying discontinuous changes, the kind of short-term things that can happen, like the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s, very sudden changes like 9/11, which were not easy to see if you weren't actually looking for weak and emerging signals. And so we found that we wanted to diversify that toolkit. And when we set up the Center for Strategic Futures, the aim that the center had was to use a more wide range of methods to actually analyze different types of change and change that took place at different time scales. So we've got a fairly plural toolkit, if you like, and we believe in methodological pluralism. And from that, we've really distilled 5 key lessons, I think, that I wanted to share today. The first of these lessons is the fact that scenario planning and foresight in general is about making better decisions. It's not about prediction. And I think this links to the point Piret made about foresight being different from risk assessment. People often ask, did you get the scenarios correct? Did you predict the future correctly? And that's kind of missing the point, because the whole point of doing strategic foresight is that it helps us to make better decisions today, not 10 days from now or not 20 years from now, but today. And we use the future as a tool, right? A way of creating a container for discussions to happen within which we can make better decisions today, because we question our assumptions about what is possible and what is not. Assumption questioning and mental model identification is a really key part of foresight. And again, this is something that Piret mentioned in her presentation. And I want to stress this because I think it's really critical to get the whole point of strategic foresight right. If we go into it trying to predict the future, then we will always have an exercise in futility, because if you identify something that you don't want to have happen and you take action about it, then clearly by definition it won't happen. And that's actually the whole point of foresight, to avoid some of those more negative trends. And if there are positive things that you want to happen, then clearly that is going to take place, right? So that's not a prediction anymore. It's kind of you framing and actualizing the future and having a very activist role in it. So this first point about decisions rather than prediction is a really key one, and it will feed into all of the other points that I will share. Because the second of those is, what exactly is the experience of doing strategic foresight like? And I like to encourage the fact that we should embrace discomfort and friction in that process. Let me say a bit more about what I mean by that. Embracing discomfort and friction has to happen, because if we are truly going to grapple with our mental models, then that is in itself a deeply discomforting experience. People may think that they are very open to a whole range of views and ways of seeing the world, but in truth, all of us have deep-seated assumptions and mental models about that world. And when those mental models are questioned, that is always going to be a discomforting experience. So the two words that I think of as any good strategic foresight practitioner always having to look out for, those words are never and always. If you believe something will never happen, or you think something will always take place, those are mental models, right? They reflect deep-held beliefs about the world. And those are the words that should set alarm bells going off for any good futurist, because they are precisely the indicators of what mental models might exist. And when people say the word never or always, that's when we need to really push them and ask them, why do you believe this? Can you consider other possibilities and options and alternatives? And in doing that, can you kind of widen your aperture in how you see the world? One result of this, right, the fact that we are always engaged in this discomforting and frictional process, is the fact that any good futures team should never be fully loved by the rest of their colleagues. If you are, then it means you're not them hard enough. It means we're not really getting to the point of the friction, right, and encouraging the questioning of mental models in as deep a way as possible. Shell, which is probably one of the most exemplary organizations using scenarios and foresight, has a great phrase for this, right? They describe how their team doing scenarios and foresight is tolerated but not embraced by the rest of the system. And I think that's a good sign, right? You want to have that level of tolerance so that the system doesn't repel and eject you, but you don't want to be totally embraced either, because that means you've been captured and are kind of too bought into the system to question it in a rigorous way. That's the second point, right, about embracing discomfort and friction. How do we do that then, right? Because it's really difficult to kind of identify your own mental models, or to necessarily know what your own mental models are if you're only talking to people who always agree with you, right? We need to get out of our own echo chamber. And we found that this is the link to the third point. We need to have networks, right? We need to embrace diverse networks in the work that we do. These networks are what help us to keep the open mindset that are actually hugely necessary for good strategic foresight. And these networks need to apply both internally and externally, right? Internally to government, Singapore actually set up what we call the Strategic Futures Network, which is a collection of one deputy secretary from every ministry. So the number 2 civil servant in each ministry, meeting once every 2 months. That's the authorizing environment, right, that Piret talked about. The senior leadership being invested in this process of doing foresight. And we set up this entity, and I was a deputy director in the mid-2000s, working with the head of civil service at the time. And the reason we'd identified that level of officer was because we knew the permanent secretaries would be too busy. They wouldn't have time. But we felt that directors only see one section of a whole ministry, whereas the DepSec sees at least a third of the ministry and, critically, has the ability to marshal resources to get foresight done. And so we found that that was the right level to have. And the network today has grown to include chief executives of many of our implementing agencies and not just the ministries. But that network allows us to question each other's assumptions and to bring to bear the work of the urban planner together with the social policy maker and the economist, as well as a security person. We get to a much richer whole of government understanding of what actually is going on. But even that network is only a government network. We need to embrace broader networks than that. And this is where we actually make sure that we are forever connected to a whole range of different people, right? Friends of our foresight system who we can talk to on things like Zoom or online now. When travel, used to occur in the dim and distant past, a lot of our foresight practitioners would travel extensively in any given year so that they could be talking to people from all over the world. So they would learn from the mental models of the French, of those in India, or people in China, and people in the US, people in Ireland, people in other parts of Europe. And we would keep pushing that because we wanted to make sure that we would learn from these mental models and complement our own. We might not be wrong in our mental models, but at least understanding what the different shades of meaning out there were for others was very helpful at a nuanced understanding of the world. So that was the point about networks, right? And I wanted to move on to the last two things, right? The fourth idea of what we've been learning is that we need to create immersive experiences in our foresight work. Once you've got the ideas for these open networks, right, both internal and external, we found it's been really critical to communicate those ideas in ways that are as immersive as possible. You could do a giant report, right? A 200-page report. But honestly, who reads those things? Some people do, but very few of us, right? And if you want to get the key ideas in that report to decision makers who don't have huge amounts of time, what we found is we need to create these immersive experiences that engage them at the head level, but also engage their hearts and emotions and engage them as whole persons. And how do we do that, right? The military actually is really good at it. They've had simulations and war games for the longest time. And that's actually the kind of situation that we need. We need to create simulate future, allow people to immerse their whole selves in that future. And that could include things like games. We've actually created a game once where we, instead of telling people that we were going into a much tighter job market, we created a game whereby all our senior decision makers got together at the civil service level, and we made them play the game where each assigned an identity and asked to go and look for a job. Of course, what they didn't know was we designed the game to be scarce in terms of jobs. So not everybody was end up with a piece of employment by the end of the game. And it was quite comical when the head of civil service did not get employed by the end of this year because they were given certain constraints in the game, right? And they had to work it out such that they got the job, but many of them didn't. And that was a way of saying, with far more powerfully than any report could, that this was the kind of situation that people are living in if they have precarious and contingent job situations. So we found that that was a useful way to do it. Sometimes if you don't have time to play the full game, it's also useful to just do semi-immersive experiences. And one thing that we are very fond of here is to create mock documents. Rather than giving people a report, giving people the front page of a newspaper is a much more visceral, immersive experience for them. And these sorts of mock documents, or a mock article from The Economist, right, or a mock piece from the New York Times. In Singapore, we have these press clippings that go out each day, kind of a summary of what's going on in the world and that's been covered by the media. Creating a mock version of that can be really powerful in terms of communicating to people exactly how the future might change and how it will affect these everyday artifacts that they're already used to seeing. So immersive experiences is the fourth point. And if I can just end off on the fifth idea, which is to adopt a design approach. If we want to be truly what we do, the design approaches are going to be key because we need to cater our strategic foresight to the needs of our users. And I'll share an idea that I learned from some friends in the UK for this, right? Where Douglas Alexander, former shadow minister of in the Labour Party, once said to a group of us in the school where I did my master's degree. He said all products should have a range of should come on a spectrum. Right? And each of those parts of the spectrum should cater to a different user need, which is what a designer does, right? We cater to the needs of our users. We don't just give them what we think we want to provide for them. And he said, all reports, all products that we do must have a diving version, right? For the people who want to go deep and who will read and scrutinize every footnote, give them the 200-page report. That's the diving version. But not everybody has that time. So you need to create a swimming version as well, right? They don't go deep, but they will still go fairly into the details here. And that would be, instead of a 200-page report, it might be a 20-page report that summarizes the key issues, doesn't go into the minutiae, but at least captures some of the key things. But then he also said, apart from the diving and the swimming, you need a wading version, right? An even less deep one that captures the key trends. And this might be a, 5-page summary, right? The executive summary of the overall report. For someone who doesn't have a huge amount of time, wants to get the gist of the issues. And then lastly, he says you need the paddling version, not just the wading, but the paddling version. That is the 1-page summary that you give to your politician when they do not have time to read anything and who only have a short car ride before they get to a meeting. Now, if we combine this, right, these diving, swimming, wading, and paddling versions with the immersive experiences that I talked about earlier, then we get to really powerful products, right? Because they will be things that capture the essence of what we want to communicate, and we can get those to actually convey some of the complexity and the nuance of this very complex future that we're trying to communicate to people. So when we put all this together, right, focusing on decision-making today and not just predictions, embracing discomfort, tapping into networks that are as wide as possible to create experiences that are immersive and design-based, that's where I think we start to slowly inch towards being a sophisticated practitioner of this slightly arcane but very interesting art of foresight. So I'll stop there and see if there are any other thoughts that come up during the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Aaron, that was fascinating. What really strikes me is that this is something you've been looking at obviously since the 1980s from the initial work that's done through the Ministry of Defence, but the degree to which it is really very sophisticated and the extent to which you're considering the end user and how you're communicating the information. I'm particularly struck too by the hearts and minds aspect of it. I'm curious, in terms of developing the initial capacity and capability, what is your model of capacity building within the Singaporean civil service before you get to the level of deputy secretary and you're attending these very regular meetings with the head of the civil service? How much exposure are you likely to have had as a generalist civil servant who is maybe operating that strategic policy space or moving in the direction of that being your kind of key role, strategy role?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks. We do actually have a team. So the current team at the Center for Strategic Futures, now that I've got out of the way and are stopping them and I'm not stopping them from achieving great heights, they now organize a regular piece of training that they call Futurecraft. So that's really scenario planning and other methodologies. Many of the things that Piret mentioned in her on her slide, right? Backcasting, visioning. We actually go through those tools with people who've been identified as strategic planners or foresight practitioners within their agencies. And it's been encouraging to see how many agencies actually have this function now, because I think people have realized that even if it's a team of 2, it's a very powerful ability to have as an organization. And so they can attend these pieces of training that are in-house and apply the methods to the kind of specific context of the public officer. But there are other courses that some agencies will send people to. The University of Houston runs a really interesting foresight course. The University of Hawaii does something. Oxford does a scenarios program. There are programs in Australia. There are parts, I think, of our own Lee Kuan Yew School has recently started to run foresight of its own. And so, we do encourage people who want to build deeper capabilities to work on that. And that's for the kind of the specific foresight practitioner who's being grown by their agencies. We've also tried to introduce foresight to members of what we like to think of as our leadership core. There's about 1% of the public sector, which is identified either as generalist leaders who will move around different agencies, kind of the way I have, or they might be identified as sectoral leaders who will do some rotations, but within a specific domain, like the economy or social policy or urban planning or security. And for all of those people who are identified as leaders, right, that's about 1,500 people. What we do is they go through training at various points of their careers, including when they within the first 2 years of joining. We call that their foundation course. And every member of the foundation course is introduced to foresight. Even if they don't love it, they at least understand what the vocabulary is so that they can be literate consumers of it in their system when they go back to work. And as they grow into their leadership roles, they can then also be literate decision makers using this methodology. So we find that equipping the leadership core with that vocabulary is a really interesting but also useful and valuable process, because it helps them to have the right sorts of language with which they can then have conversations. So everybody in Singapore in that leadership core will know what a driving force is. They will understand what the language of a scenario is. They will know what a critical uncertainty is. And I think that helps us to have planning conversations that are much more unified because we share the same base language.
Okay, that's really interesting. One final question before we move on to Barry. What as Singapore has developed a more sophisticated system of strategic foresight that covers all these elements of capacity building and prioritizing the issue by having it regularly linked in to key decision makers, and that the chair of that meeting, can influence the resources. So it is prioritized. Over the course of the decades, because it is decades since you started this in the 1980s, has this approach changed your public service itself, the civil service, the structure of it, the kind of skills that you're looking to develop? How has it influenced your public service, the design of your public service?
That's a fascinating question. I love it, Grace. Thanks very much. It has and it hasn't, is what I would say, because so the ways in which I think we've changed are, first of all, in very specific policy domains where we've identified specific areas that are gaps in our current mental models. We've had to make sure that those get addressed. So I'll give you a very concrete example of this. In the first set of scenarios that we did nationally, right, not just in the Ministry of Defense. So this was in 1997. I believe 95 to 97. And we were thinking about what the world might look like in 2015. It's funny, right, when you think about a 20-year set of scenarios, which we've gone past. And we did a whole bunch of interviews with a range of both decision makers and experts. And one thing that became very clear, I say we, I was doing A-levels at the time, so I was not this is a bit more of a royal, I suppose. In 1997, I was a student. But what was interesting is that when I read through the files on this, what we saw was a situation where everybody had a great economic vocabulary. People were thinking in very international terms. There wasn't a huge amount of emphasis on social issues, things around national identity. What does it mean to be Singaporean? What does it mean to call this place home? Now, these are quite broad and in a lot of ways very amorphous issues, but they're important, right? If you don't get these things right, then the psychic elements of what constitutes a nation become much harder to identify and pinpoint. And so we realized that was part of the mental model, right? Everybody was thinking very much about economics. They were thinking very practical geopolitical issues, but no one was thinking about the domestic stuff. And so one thing that came out of the scenarios in that process was that we actually set up more dedicated agencies to develop a sense of local volunteering, local social capital, local relationship formation, so that these gaps would actually start to get addressed. So that's one of the restructurings that have happened in a very specific policy domain, which was identified as a gap by Foresight. More broadly, as we do foresight, one thing we've realized is that, words like resilience, agility, things that you mentioned, right, in the introduction to this session, are going to become much more key. And we need to therefore develop capabilities within each agency to have agility and resilient response. But we also need to cater to today's needs, right? We can't only study the future. We've got to make sure that today's outcomes also get met. And so the question becomes, how do we do this? How do we do this in a way that doesn't compromise now, but also doesn't end up being prejudicial to the future because we have ignored it and let the urgent tyrannize the long term? And one I think really interesting thing is pretty much every ministry now has some kind of planning or futures or strategy function in which it is kind of pushing this agenda of the future and making sure that, in a sense, right, the future has a place at the table because somebody has been talking about it and making sure that its interests are catered to. So in my own ministry, we don't do that through a dedicated unit, although that is one model that you could adopt. In my own ministry, what we've done is we actually have a director who's in charge of it. So there's dedicated attention, but she has license, and the authorizing environment has allowed her to basically pick one person from every division in the ministry and all of our agencies as well, who is their kind of official futures representative. And they work with her to make sure that the future in their domain is reflected. And what that allows us to do is to do futures in a way that brings to bear the collective wisdom of the whole agency family, rather than just a single set of people who might be exploring one or two esoteric ideas. This is harder than a dedicated unit because it is much more untidy, right? And it involves people sharing their staff rather than having very dedicated functions. But I think in the long term, this is the more resilient structure because it allows us to actually tap into a range of domains and actually pivot very quickly as issues evolve. So I think the structure of how we operate is now much more complexity friendly, much more agile. And we have both the fixed structures of today's functions, as well as the more agile structures, the scrum teams of the future, which allow us to actually kind of then oscillate between them.
That's fascinating.
I hope that helps.
That's really, really interesting. Yeah, that's fantastic. Aaron, many thanks. Really enjoyed your presentation, and there's lots of insights there for us. And I'm sure our audience have questions that they are thinking to address. So, before I introduce Barry, I'd like to invite our audience to submit questions to Piret and Aaron and Barry, and we will have time to answer those questions. So please do submit your questions. So thanks, Aaron. And on to our final speaker, Barry. Barry Lowry, I'd like to invite you to make your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Grace. And thanks to Piret and Aaron. I really enjoyed your presentations. So if we could go to the first slide. What I agreed with Grace I would talk about today was how we might use strategic foresight in an area like digital government, which is so critical, I guess, to the future of Ireland and the future of Europe. It's very interesting that the Commission have recommended that 20% of the resilience and recovery budget should be allocated to digital. So it is being seen as a way to design a better future. And that's really what I want to talk about this afternoon. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I think it's good when you're talking about strategic foresight to know what your baseline is. Where are you actually starting from? So if we could maybe go to the next slide. So this is a document that only has come out in the last few weeks. This is the European DESI Index, when the Commission basically use various data streams to try and make an estimate of where the various member states are in their digital journey. And as you can see, Ireland is just above and to the left of the big blue dot in the middle, which is the European standard. What that tells us is that we probably can do more in terms of the digital availability of our services. And that's been no surprise to us, because if we go to the next slide, this is a document that was produced by Fletcher School in the US, and that assessed the digital health of many countries globally. And Ireland was seen to be one of the countries where it had achieved a lot in terms of digital government or e-government at the time, but it probably was not accelerating at the same rate as some of the countries you will see in the right of that. If we could go to the next slide. This was something that they specifically highlighted. We worked with the Fletcher School in the report we produced with Microsoft, Enabling Digital Ireland. And you can see at the 7 o'clock position, there's quite an indented public service, and 11 o'clock in terms of developing talent as well. So we've a pretty good idea of where our challenges are and how we go about trying to fix them. So if we could go to the next slide, please. This is something that actually came out of the Public Service ICT strategy in 2015. And I think actually it was quite insightful in its own right, because obviously it was 5 years ago. What the government tried to do at that time, and what OGCIO tried to do at that time, was try and move Irish public service to a place where it was well positioned to benefit from initiatives like the digital single market, and where it was well positioned to use digital and technology to provide a better service to its citizens. And of course, as we'll see, it proved to be remarkably insightful in terms of how some of our priorities were set out and then delivered. So just starting at the top, these were a number of principles that were the basis of the strategy. And the first principle was that our citizens should be able to access government services at a time and place convenient to them and using their device of choice. And of course, that device of choice at the time was perceived to be a mobile phone or a tablet, but increasingly is becoming a voice-activated device as well. And if we were going to enable that to happen, if we look then at digital services, all digital services needed to be consistent and easy to use. We found that depending on the agency that was providing them, there were slightly different approaches being used to provide those services, which of course can be confusing. The other thing we really needed to do was deploy our digital services in a way that recognized the diversity of our society. So we're heading that between 15 and 20%, for example, of people who live in Ireland are non-Indigenous. So they're going to have more language challenges, or some of them are, than citizens who were born and raised in Ireland. And also we do have people with visual and learning difficulties, and we want to brace all of them in the digital government journey. If we're going to provide then better digital services, we need to do better things with our data. One of the things that we liked about the European e-government action plan in 2016 was the idea of once only. In other words, we shouldn't ask the citizens to give us information that we already hold about them. And that became a key part of our strategy and how we took the strategy forward, that we would stop collecting data many times from the citizen for different government functions, that we would reuse their data in a transparent and specific way to deliver the best possible service and more proactive service to them. Under that then were the three enabler pillars, I guess, or building blocks. The first one being, it's hard to share data if everyone's got their own data holdings and their own computers locked up in their own computer rooms. So the movement to cloud, whether that's public cloud or government cloud, was a key part of what we wanted to do. And in the middle then, the capability, not just the people designing the systems, but also the business people having the understanding of how technology can help deliver the services better. And then, of course, thirdly, the citizens themselves, that they would have the confidence and capability to use the systems. And then finally, obviously, we needed good governance over this to make sure that we were good stewards of our data, to make sure we were doing the right things in the right way. And we needed legislation as well. So if we could just move to the next slide, please. What this slide tells us is that if we hadn't have made those preparations, if we hadn't have done the work in EID that we did, if we hadn't have built the gov.ie portal, we would have really struggled to respond to the surge in public adoption or public demand for digital government services following the pandemic and obviously what changed in our lives from March of this year on. And you can see in the left this massive growth in verified MyGov ID accounts from the middle of March right the way through to May. And that growth actually has been exponential. In May, there was over 600,000 verified MyGov ID accounts. Now there's over 880,000 verified MyGov ID accounts, and it continues to grow. And then, of course, in the other slide, we saw a 500% increase in just one quarter on gov.ie accesses compared to the entire 2019, which was actually quite healthy compared to other European states in itself. So what this told us was that the public were ready to do more with digital, to engage more with government in a digital fashion. If we could just move to the next slide, please. This is one of my favorite OECD slides because it shows the transition from analog government to e-government, which I guess is where Ireland is well advanced in its journey. But the third arrow in grey, digital government, is actually where the real challenge is for us. And I think this is where strategic foresight comes in, because e-government is very much treating digital as another channel. In other words, another way to provide the same services that the public require. Digital government is a way to completely reimagine what public services look like, because technology enables different things to happen in different ways than it has ever done before. And if we could just go to the next slide, please. These are just 3 examples of where we've tried to adopt that thinking, where digital government and the associated technology should enable us to completely rethink how we do things. So to the left of the slide, we have the action plan that came out of our Chrono GovTech Day, which was in the middle of last year. And basically during that day, we brought in representatives from industry, both startup and established multinationals, representatives from academia. We brought in students, we brought in a range of public servants, and we asked them to imagine what an ecosystem might look like, where we had the academic prowess of Ireland, its public service, investment, and the citizens as 4 stakeholders, developing a completely different model of engagement to create the best possible digital government experience for our citizens. And you can see in the recommendations which are now being considered how to take forward by government, some very powerful ideas emerged by that very different thinking that emerged in that day, thinking that was very much prompted by strategic foresight approaches and tools. In the middle then we have our contact tracing app, and I'm very proud to say that it probably is the most successful contact tracing app in the world. Apologies, Aaron. But the reason why I say that is that we really set out to design this with the interests of all stakeholders in mind. The timing was considered very carefully, because obviously if we launched too early, people might have got bored with it by the time we really needed it. The timing had to be just perfect, and the functionality had to be just perfect. So we engaged with the public to really understand what they wanted in a contact tracing app, but also privacy was at the very heart of this. So we really needed to understand the trade between using the data we collected, but designing the app in a privacy first way. And I think we realized we had hit the sweet spot when we saw the media reaction, and indeed our own Data Protection Commissioner's Office reaction to the app itself. Obviously, we published the Data Protection Impact Assessment and indeed the DPC's comments on it, and we published the code. Secondly, then, the reaction of the public. We had nearly 1 million downloads in the first 24 hours, which was staggering for a small country. But thirdly, the fact that it continues to be used every day and has become a key part of our defence against the disease. But finally, the fact that it's been adopted in other countries. So as of today, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Gibraltar, and 5 states of America, including New York and New Jersey, all use the Ireland contact tracing app with their own skins on it, which is a remarkable achievement for a small country with a small budget. The final area I just wanted to touch on was a partnership that we have with Trinity Business School. And we work with their Masters in Digital Marketing course. That was very attractive for us for a couple of reasons. First of all, as you can see in the picture, they're young people and they're digital natives, to use the cliche. But secondly, they're 80% non-Indigenous. So we're benefiting from the diversity of opinions in terms of how Ireland's digital government services should be deployed and how they should look to the public. And what we did was we took a number of life scenarios and we asked them in teams of 6 to try and carry out those life scenarios digitally. So you can see small claims court, applying for Irish citizenship and so on is in there. And they basically wrote up a report and a presentation on their experience and recommendations as to how we might do it even better. And given, of course, that they were experts in digital marketing, some of those recommendations are actually very powerful, very interesting, and very forward-thinking. So we can just go to the next slide, please. I loved Aaron's comment about strategic foresight is not predicting the future, it's making better predictions. I think another great benefit of strategic foresight is that it encourages people to start to try and design their own reasonable futures, their own co-create, if you like, a compelling vision of the future. And of course, when you do that, you create passion to actually deliver the roadmap to achieve it. So if you think of the OECD document or slide that I showed earlier on, one of the things that we know is that as we head towards OPS 2030, that Ireland will be ahead of most of Europe in terms of every citizen that wants it can be connected to the internet using a very fast connection. We know that citizens can use their mobile phones, and 5G and possibly 6G will be prominent, and they'll be able to access government services in their phone. But the challenge that we have is, are we just going to evolve the services that they will use, or are we going to reimagine those services? So how can we reimagine education in the world of the National Broadband Plan? Well, just to give you an example, it no longer means the teacher has to be in the room. So it's not unforeseeable that a lecture to Irish students doing their junior or senior cert could be given by Piret or Aaron from their own countries using the broadband that we have. And so it opens up a whole new world of education. If you think of reimagining healthcare, the fact that it could be quite reasonable for someone to have an assessment done on them in their own home via video conference, or a retired physician can be joining into a case review notes and giving the doctors the benefits of their great experience because it's easy for them to connect online and securely see the data. Or you think of our own government services. Why can't we reimagine how those services can look? If the public want help to use digital via a contact centre, we should make one available. If we can move our services into the shopping centre and make them available at more hours of the day and on Saturdays and Sundays, then that's what we should do. And so we're thinking differently about how we use technology to provide a better, more holistic, more equitable service to our citizens. If we go then to the final slide. I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon and be part of this panel. And I look forward to the panel session.
That's brilliant, Barry. Thank you so much. That was really interesting to understand the various building blocks that have been put in place in recent years, and to see how digitalization has really been fundamental to how citizens have adjusted to COVID. When you see the drive in traffic, that while they're having gov.ie in place and having the various components pre-existing, that it was there ready when people needed it. I'm struck by as well, I think it was the recently published European Commission report, Strategic Foresight report, charting the course towards a more resilient Europe. It talks about digital resilience, and it describes that as being, ensuring that the way we live, work, learn, interact, preserves, enhances human dignity. Freedom, equality, security, democracy, all these things. And it identifies how the COVID crisis has accelerated hyperconnectivity and integration of new technologies affecting the human condition and how we live. And here you talk about how high-speed broadband really opens up a world of possibility in terms of how we deliver public services across the board, and how the GovTech Crinne, which means gathering, it's an Irish word for gathering, in pulling together industry, citizens, people from different walks of life, and giving them the opportunity, because a lot of this is allowing us to step back and take the opportunity to reimagine what the future might look like, and the transformation opportunities in particular of digitalization. And I'm reminded too of what Piret and Aaron were talking about as well. When you get diverse people in a room together, and when you get that what Piret has done, I think that crazy idea, Piret, that people may have initially balked at, but actually it's all on the table here. We have an opportunity here to reimagine how our public services how access to public services could be improved, how, as you were saying, Barry, how healthcare systems could be improved through AI, how universal access could be improved. So yeah, I'd like to throw open the question to all our panelists in terms of the potential of digitalization and how it could transform our lives, our society's lives, our businesses, how public services are delivered, how people's day-to-day experiences of the education system, of the health sector could be transformed. Aaron, would you like to answer that question, or Piret?
I'll jump in with a little response. It's a big question, but I think it's a worthwhile one to get. And I actually did my PhD on digital government, so this is a topic that's very, very close to my. I agree completely with what Barry said. About we need to think of this as transforming what we do and how we do it, not just a new mode of delivery. Right. This is about really of what it means to provide public services. Just two quick examples, right? And this really is applying foresight thinking to that future. We're asking ourselves, how do we use data to understand people much better so that we can provide genuinely user-focused services rather than just what the government thinks people need or what is efficient and easy for us to provide? User provision used to mean you talk to a small subset of people, you do a survey, and you hope that the sample is representative. But today, there's actual data of how people use websites. You know where their eyes look. You know what they're clicking on. You know what they're not clicking on. You know what apps they use. You know which parts of the apps they use. We have data on all of that, and we can therefore design around what actual usage is like and what user needs actually are. There's a whole phrase in academic literature about needs-based holism in digital government, right? And the fact that governments can now respond in a much more holistic way to what the needs of citizens are rather than hypothesize about them. So I think that's key. And I would add one short plug about digital foresight as well, because foresight doesn't just have to be the content of the digital future, right? Or rather, digital doesn't just have to be stuff that we analyze and study. We can do strategic foresight in digitally enabled ways. We can reach out to far more people now than we used to be able to. There is a growing amount of software that allows us to amalgamate large numbers of views so that we actually understand what a good subsection of a system is thinking, rather than just have to make guesses and hypotheses about So I think we can afford to think about technology as changing the very nature of foresight and the methodologies that we are using, not just the content of our prognostications about the future. I'll stop there and see what Piret would like to add to this.
Excellent. So I think that, I fully concur with Aaron as well. As the questions from your own field are the most difficult. So I am also research algorithmic governance and the topic. So it's a very complicated issue. But what I would say for future thinking and foresight practices is that the importance to bring in mixed teams from both the side of the people who understand technology and on the other side of who understand human behavior is going to be extremely important, because we're now going and getting to that phase when the kind of the second maturity of the digital transformation is happening at the moment, that we are, we have made everything that is analog digital, and the next wave is actually going to be doing digital by design things. So we start by digital and we are using the opportunities of the technology itself. And that's more complicated, and that is led by technological opportunities. And digital transformation is doing actually two very opposing things. So it allows to put together big data and make those collective insights visible. So you can centralize decision making, get rid of different layers of government or organizations, because you don't need analytical work to happen in different bureaucracy or hierarchies. But on the other side, it's also what ICT is doing is that it allows us to become very personalized with our responses, and also decentralized by design. So you can have decentralized responses and also, blockchain approaches and different communities connecting across the world on specific issues. So it's really like opposing both doing centralization and decentralization. And now the question is that what is public sector going to do about it? So which kind of approaches, which road are we going? And probably the road is going to be mixed. So different services are going to be, predictive governance versus localized solutions are going to happen at the same time. So we really need to think about what kind of models to adopt.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think one of the things that's really liberating as well about OPS 2030 is it's far enough away that people will not get tied up too much in where we are today, because sometimes that's where government policy really struggles. That if you're reimagining healthcare, people think, well, what about the hospital down the road, or what about this, or what about that? Or if you're reimagining how civil servants work, you've got the unions worrying about people who work in certain jobs that, the media would say are most at risk by AI. The thing about OPS 2030 is it enables you to start with what do we believe we can achieve by 2030, and then you start to develop the roadmap to get there. And that becomes less subjective then and more objective. And because it's about designing a better future, as I said in the presentation, it gets people very passionate about how that might be done, and also very engaged. I mean, we find with the digital government stuff, we've had no problem at all getting the public to really get involved and have a say on how they would like things to be, which has been very powerful.
If I could just add one quick thought on that, Grace. I love the underlying thinking that's going on here. Piret mentioned in her remarks that we should not only think about, but also aim to frame the future. And Barry talked about shouldn't just react to the future, we should aim to influence it. I think both of these suggest certain proactiveness in our approach to the future, not just waiting for it to happen to us, but trying to actually determine it. The phrase that the methodological experts in futures like to use for this is that there's a difference between adaptive futures and activist futures. Adaptive futures being a situation where you kind of say, well, let the world happen to me and I will adjust and adapt to it, versus an activist approach which says I will shape that future in the ways that I want it to be, Now, this is a difficult balance, actually, right? Because, I mean, I think we come from small countries, right? We are price takers in the global economy in most meaningful ways. So we can't always be activists about everything, but neither are we powerless, right? We have the ability to shape certain things. And if I had to ask myself what scenario planning and foresight has done most fundamentally in Singapore, I think I would say that it has empowered civil servants to realize that while they can't influence everything about the future, they can still be activists, and they have agency in the process of determining at least some aspects. And I do think that sense of overall agency is critical, because we believe that we're nothing but victims in the system, then we will act that way. And I think our communities become much more eviscerated and far less empowered.
Yeah, I mean, I think a real learning in this, Grace, is that you almost set the culture that you want to be. You know, to use an analogy, I remember, thanks to my brother-in-law and a bottle of wine, we agreed we would do the London Marathon. And I bought a book about training to do a marathon. And one of the really enlightening things in that book was you can either set your target from where you are today, or you can set your target from what you would love to be and then develop the plan accordingly. Now, of course, you have to be realistic about this. And what Aaron said, you know, we're a small country. But at the time, my target wasn't to break the world record at the London Marathon. It was a target that I believed a man of 40 years of age at the time and 15 stone could achieve. But then I started to follow the training plan that they set out. And then I suddenly realized I was going to achieve my target. And I think there's a learning in that we can use at public service level as well. I think we can set an OPS 2030 that gets people passionate, but also that we can show we're achieving. And when you show you're achieving it, you win public support, you win political support, you get the funding for the future phases. So I think it's very possible for us to answer your exam question, it's very possible for us to develop an OPS 2030 that is exciting, engaging, and achievable.
That's brilliant to hear all your interventions. Sorry, Piret.
No, I just wanted to add on to that what was Aaron and Larry have been saying as well, as that I think the empowering question is one of the critical things, because I have yet to talk to a civil servants, and I talk to civil servants around the world, and I have yet to meet the civil servants who doesn't have, you know, real deep future-oriented policy problems or complex issues in their policy field. And they really know that they're facing these issues and you need to act. And what doesn't seem to happen is that, you know, they put their head above the water and start acting. And this is known as the minimal squeak behavior or squawk behavior as well, that when things are tolerable, you don't want to throw attention to yourself, because, you know, when you start making noise, then you end up doing things. And when you don't have resources to actually do something about it, then you are, you know, paddling in the ocean and, you know, you're there all alone. So you have to also be kind of empowered. I mean, every civil servant that I have talked to, also in Ireland as well, has kind of list of complex issues that they want to deal with, or problems that they want to solve in their policy area as well. So they actually need kind of resources and tools to do something about that. And someone to say that this is actually expected, because we saw, and also in Ireland, we see that there's so much innovation happening when there's this external drive. You know, you can't do the minimal squeak thing anymore, because there's this crisis that says you have to do it. But if we're not in a crisis mode, or at least we don't know that we are, you know, we are in a climate crisis, but most of us really don't know or acknowledge that, then it doesn't seem to activate the people. So the empowerment and the activation angle is one of the kind of the crucial elements of creating that system.
Yeah, I really like that word empowerment, and that sense of your idea, Barry, that 2030, it's an objective time frame. It's not going to impinge, and it links into what you're saying, Piret, about people's those restricting limitations around resources and complexity. We need to strike out, and the conversations around megatrends and reimagining enable us, empower us to do that. We've very, very little time. We could talk here for hours. Really interesting conversation. I love all your contributions. Brita, is there time for a question from the audience or two?
Hi everyone, and fantastic presentations. Yeah, we have tons of questions and comments. We won't get through them all, unfortunately, but I'll just call out a few. So the first question is for Aaron. What are the common mistakes we do in foresight planning? What shouldn't we do? And actually, Piret could probably answer that as well.
Should I take that now, or do you want to tell us a few questions so we can cover all more ground?
No, you want to take that now, I think, and then we'll come to a different topic. Yeah.
Okay, all right, I can do that. Common mistakes. First of all, not keeping your user in mind. I remember a team who wrote a whole series of very prosy work, and I said to them, put some numbers on page 1 because the person you're sending this to is highly numerate and will want to see numbers. And they looked at me like it was very strange, and they was like, why? I said, well, I don't know, just something in, right? A statistic, a bar graph, a table, but numbers, not letters. And then they didn't do it and put it on page 2. Sent the report off, they got a reply within 5 minutes saying, this doesn't look very rigorous. There's not enough quantitative support to the whole thing, at which point I laughed and I said, I told you. And then got another note saying, oh, I saw the graph on the second page. This looks quite decent. I'll read the rest of it later. So not keeping a user in fatal error, I think. The other is to assume that this is a neat series of events and that everything needs to be done at a single point. I'll tell you what I mean by that. You will never move mental models or make better decisions in a single seating. If you're meeting folks for the first time, they are not going to like your scenarios or your futures because if those truly challenge their mental models. People need time to adjust to new ideas that kind of ask them to shift their deep assumptions about the world. So we need to think of futures and foresight as a campaign, not just a single event. And sometimes you'll find that the very, very allergic reactions of the first time someone sees a new piece of foresight will be quite different from what they think of it in 2 or 3 weeks' time, even though not many changes have been made to the overall analysis and the material therein. So I think keeping in mind that this is a campaign that we need to be on, not just a single event, is a really critical aspect of this. I'll stop there. Thanks, Brita.
Thanks, Aaron. Piret, maybe do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll actually build onto that. So my number one peeve connected to this is don't see it as a linear process. We all live in political cycles, and we know strategic planning cycles as well. To say we now start to do a policy, and let's do kind of foresight exercise in the beginning of that policy, and then we pretend that we have predicted the world, and we make a strategic plan, and then maybe in 3-4 years' time we do another foresight exercise to plan the new strategic plan. Like, this is not how to do foresight. As we're talking today as well, should be a continuous dynamic activity, which also should be challenging to your strategic plans, because we should be able to change our strategies based on evolving patterns and the decisions we make. Every decision that we make today will influence the type of futures that we're going to do. So it has to be a kind of core part of your strategic planning process and not locked down into these kind of one-time events.
Thanks, Piret. Another quick question from Anna. She wants to know, are there any daily tools for how to introduce strategic insight into our own teams within the public service, into the public service environment, bending off the crippling whataboutism that Barry just mentioned? Did I pronounce that right, Barry? Barry, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is to actually get the space and time to do it. There's loads of tools available. We used the old ones of SWOT and SOAR and so on when we did the Corona GovTech session. But the key thing is to actually get the space available where people are not distracted by other things, and allow them the room to talk, and allow everybody to contribute. I think, I think it was Aaron said earlier on, he mentioned diversity. I remember when we were listening to the presentation by one of the Trinity MSc groupings. They were talking about the immigration process, and one of the foreign students said, clearly your approach to people coming and living in Ireland has been designed by Irish people. And I think it's really important to embrace that diversity and get that opinion fed into your planning.
Thanks, Barry. Mark Callanan has a comment and a question. So he said, thanks so much for the thoughtful presentations. He's been involved in a couple of foresight projects before in Ireland a number of years ago, and his impression was that the main beneficiaries tend to be those most closely involved. So his question is, do the panel have ways of disseminating the insights that arise from these exercises to those less closely involved in the exercises? And also, summaries and mock headlines sound good, but are there other approaches? So maybe we'll go back to Aaron. Do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I actually think it's hugely important to involve as much of the system as we can, and not just, as you say, the kind of the converted or the ones who are most obviously linked. As an old adage that foresight practitioners use is to say, get the system in the room, and that's how you start understanding what the future of that system look like. So we need to involve people in this conversation, I think. At the very least, I think putting material online can be handy, and so that people have access to summaries of discussions or even detailed notes of the discussion. But more importantly, if we can involve people in some of that process, I think that could work even better. One thing we did in Singapore some years ago is one of our think tanks, so this is not a government effort, but one of our think tanks called the Institute for Policy Studies did a set of scenarios on what Singapore would look like in 2020. We did the process in 2011, I think. And then they actually got the material up. This was done with 80 people, maybe, generating different scenarios. But from the material they got, they gave it to a theater company and said, can you create an exhibition that people can come visit? And so this exhibition involved, creating new national songs, new nursery rhymes for children. People walked through a museum of the future. So we asked ourselves, what in 2020 would be defunct that existed in 2011, right? So they went through the museum, they saw a video, and after they watched the video, they came out, and then one of the actors from the video was there to have a conversation with them about the future that he had just been part of. And I think the more we can involve people in those sorts of findings, again, right, those are not deep, detailed reports. They are versions of the future that people can be immersed in. I think that actually makes the overall foresight product even more powerful and more viscerally engaging. Thanks, Britta.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Aaron. Maybe Piret, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think that what the problem is that we have to make the value chain a little bit more transparent, in a sense that like foresight exercises for those who are corely involved kind of indicates to me that the afterwards decision-making process wasn't very transparent. So what kind of decisions were actually made based on that exercise? So if you invest your time into that process, I would also want to know what came out of that, like what happened based on that. So also to give that knowledge in terms of, we, based on that exercise, we made those decisions. And you as a participant are benefiting, or we make our policy based on that. So also to make that like the innovation process or decision-making process, what happened next, also visible in a website format or on other communication formats that are reachable to people or are relatable to them. Because otherwise, indeed, the question might be that we keep the decision-making and the innovative process very hidden, and then we say, so what? I dedicated so much of my time and nothing really happened with this. I would be disappointed as well.
Okay, thank you. I think we just have time for one more quick question. Even though there's tons more, but Shane Kelleher has an interesting one. He talks about wargaming, and he said it's widely used in military where staff can interrogate and to future-proof the idea. And it is taught at all levels. Their career to wargame their policy ideas from all angles. Maybe Barry,
so, we lost you.
Oh, sorry.
We lost the end of the question. You went, sound went.
So, should policymakers be taught throughout their career to wargame their policy ideas from all angles, to interrogate the idea? Maybe Barry, if you'd like to take that one.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I like the term wargame exactly, but in digital we talk about user journey maps, which effectively achieves the same outcome. So the idea is that the danger is that if you sit in a room with a group of other developers and you're all similar age and ethnicity and so on, you design the world as you see it. Whereas user journey maps is going out and talking to various constituents and finding out the good, the bad, and the ugly of their life engaging with government or whatever that has. So, you know, if our scenario was, how do we deal with the homeless crisis? Then the way you do that is you find out, how are people made homeless? What was the experience they went through? What in their opinion could have resolved it, and so on. So you're actually collecting data from the people who are directly impacted by the policy. And I think that achieves the same result. And it's probably what the questioner is thinking of, actually. You know, it's not about the planners themselves deciding how the world's going to be. It's about getting a wider audience involved and getting that input, which might change your mind as to how you were going to do something.
Thanks, Barry. I don't know if either Aaron wants to.
15 seconds on this. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Games are a huge thing in my life, and I think they're hugely important. I agree with Barry. They don't need to be war games, but games and serious play are hugely useful. And the reason they're useful is they allow us to immerse ourselves in a full scenario, right? And bring all of ourselves, right? Our minds, our hearts, our bodies. You get tired from a war game, and that's what you want. You want to really stress test the complexity of that situation and whether your assumptions are robust in that overall situation. We actually have a lab in our government that creates games precisely so that we can stress test policy outcomes, and we use it as a training function. And I think where we've been able to do that, and people learn far more and it sticks more when they play games rather than going through kind of endless series of PowerPoint slides. We have a little game called Sense and Sensibilities, which I love to play because it's all about learning finance rules. I mean, you know, that thing that none of us really wants to learn because it just feels boring. We put people through this game and they learn the finance rules like that, right? They understand what it means to do procurement. They know what to do with when they need quotations, when they don't, because they've lived it. They played a board game and have actually learned how to do that. So, huge fan of gamifying what we can, because I think it gives a simulation of real life and helps us to rehearse what our outcomes might be in a much more complex reality. Sorry, I had to do that plug for games.
No, I think my next comment is going to be to Singapore. I think I'll pass it back to Grace now. I think we've gone way over, but I'll pass it back to Grace to close.
Yeah,
thanks very much.
Thanks, Brita. Thank you very much, the three of you, for such wonderful presentations in terms of ideas for how we can develop OPS 2030. You've given us plenty of food for thought and plenty of avenues that we might explore, gaming being one I hadn't thought of before, Aaron, but if it helps learn the procurement rules in a fun way, that could be useful. I'm conscious of time. We've gone over time. Do, Aaron, do. That'd be a good start. I'm conscious of time, Aaron. It's approaching 11 o'clock in Singapore. I really appreciate each of your time in being with us here today. And to the audience who have participated, it's been a brilliant session, really, really enjoyable. To the audience, anybody listening, we're into day 3 of Innovation Week tomorrow. There's lots of more very interesting speakers and sessions that we hope that you'll have time to engage with. And as Barry was saying, it's often having the space and time to sit back and think about these new ideas and move towards reimagining what the future could be, that there's great value in having the opportunity to spend time like this. Stephen Shapiro is going to be the keynote speaker tomorrow. You can still register for these events. So that's it. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to Brita and the innovation team for making this happen. It's been really brilliant. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day.